This video tutorial I will explain string security for user sign-in. In this example, we will use token-based authentication. Here you can see the API client. Here you can see the server. And API client sends username and password to the server. And URL is /login. HTTP method is post. What server will do is it will validate username and password against database. And if it is valid, then server will generate JWT token and send it to the API client. And then for any further request, the API client has to send JWT token to the server. Suppose API client wants to get particular user information, then it has to send request to this URL user slash then the user ID. HTTP method is get, and in authorization header it has to specify bearer space JWT token. Then what server will do is it will get JWT token from authorization header, and it will validate the JWT token is valid or not. And if it is valid, then it will send a response back to the API client. In this example, username is email and password is password. So I have created the class user login request model, and it has email and password fields, and getter and setter methods for these two fields. In web security class, we have overridden configure method, which accept authentication manager builder. In authentication manager builder object, we are setting user detail service and the password encoder. This user detail service is used to load user details from the database. We will see that. Here you can see web security class, which extends web security configurer adapter. And here I have overridden configure method, and like we discussed, we are setting user detail service object to authentication manager builder object, and also the password encoder, which is bcrypt password encoder. And user detail service object is user service. User service is the interface, and which extends user detail service interface, and this interface belongs to Spring related package, and it has load user by username method, and this user service interface is implemented by user service imbuilt class. And in this class I have overridden load user by username method, and which accept username. In our example, username is email, and based on the email I am getting user entity object from the database. And if user entity object is null, then it throws user not found exception, and if user entity is present, then I am creating the user object. And this user class belongs to Spring Framework related package. And this constructor accept username, password, and authorities. And it returns to the caller. Here I have defined the class security constants, and expiration time I have specified this value, and it is equivalent to 10 days, and token prefix is bearer, then space, then header string is authorization, and sign up URL, which we have already seen, /users, and token secret. When you call this method, it will get it from application properties file. And this token secret value used for generating JWT token. Here I have defined the class authentication filter, which extends username password authentication filter. And we have to override two methods. The first method is attempt authentication, and second method is successful authentication. In attempt authentication method, what we have to do is we have to get the username and password from the incoming request, and we have to check whether incoming username and password is matching against the database username and password, and if matches, then this successful authentication method will be called. And in successful authentication method, what we have to do is we have to generate JWT token and add the JWT token and the public user ID to the response header. We will see the code now. Here I have defined the class authentication filter, which extends username password authentication filter. And here I have overridden attempt authentication method like we discussed. And here what I am doing is from the incoming request, I am getting username and password. And in our case, username and password is email and the password. So user login request model object will be created, and we will get here. Then next step, I am authenticating whether the email and password is there in the database. If it is there in the database and if it is matching, then this successful authentication method will be called. And in this method, what I am doing is from authentication object, I am getting the username, and then next step, I am generating the JWT token. To generate JWT token, username, expiration time, and signature algorithm, and token secret is needed. And once token is generated, I am setting to the response header. And header key is authorization. Along with token, we have to set public user ID in the response header. For that, from users table, we have to get this public user ID and set it to the response header. And using this piece of code, based on username, I am getting the user DTO object, and then from user DTO object, I am getting the public user ID. I am setting to the response header. Response key is user ID, and value is this particular user ID. Here we are calling get user method and passing the username. Username is email ID, and here you can see get user method, and it accept email, and using email I am getting user entity object from the users table. If user entity object is not there, then it will throw user not found exception. And if user entity object is there in users table, then here what I am doing is from user entity object, I am copying all property values to the return user DTO object. Then returns the DTO object back to the caller. And here we will get the user DTO object. Here I have defined the class authentication filter, and this filter we have to add it in the web security. And here you can see the web security class. In configure method, I am adding the filter, which is authentication filter. Here I am calling get authentication filter method, and this method returns authentication filter object, and authentication filter object is added here. And in this method, what I am doing is I am creating authentication filter object and setting filter processes URL as /login, and it returns authentication filter object. So whenever we send request to this /login URL, the authentication filter methods will be executed. We will see that. Now I am going to start this application in debug mode. On the application startup, this configure method is called, and in authentication manager builder object, we are setting user detail service and password encoder as bcrypt password encoder. And also this configure method is called in web security class, and here we are adding authentication filter. And authentication filter will be called if the URL has /login. And here you can see the server has been started successfully. Now I am going to send request to this login endpoint, and HTTP method is post. And here I have selected JSON, and in the body I am sending email and password. Click on send, and request reached authentication filter, and it called attempt authentication method. So this username and password will be mapped to this user login request model object. And here you can see the email is peter@gmail.com, and password is pass123, which we have sent from Postman client. Here what it will do is it will match incoming username and password with database username and password. And if matches, then this successful authentication method will be called. And here we are getting the username from the authentication object. Username is peter@gmail.com, and here we are building JWT token. And here we got the token. Then what I am doing is I am getting user DTO object using username. Username is peter@gmail.com. Then adding the token to the response header, and from the DTO object I am getting public user ID and set it to the response header. And here we got successful output. Status code is 200 OK, and click on header, and here you can see we got authorization header, and we got the token, JWT token. Bearer, after that space, then we got the JWT token. And here we got public user ID, and for further request we have to send this JWT token to the server so that other requests will work. We will see that. Next we will implement authorization filter. Here I have defined the class authorization filter, which extends basic authentication filter and overrides do filter internal method. In this method what we have to do is we have to check authorization header is there or not, and if authorization header is there, then get the JWT token and check the JWT token is valid or not. And if JWT token is valid, then allow the user to proceed with the protected resource or protected endpoint. Else we should not allow user to proceed with the protected resource or protected endpoint. Here I have defined the class authorization filter, which extends basic authentication filter and provide implementation of do filter internal method. And here what I am doing is I am getting the header value by passing the header string. Header string is authorization, and if header is null, or if header does not contain token prefix is bearer, then it will go inside this if block, and it won't allow the user to proceed with the protected resource or protected endpoint. And if header is there, then it will call this get authentication method, and in this method what I am doing is I am getting the header, and if header not equal to null, then from the header I am getting the token, then I am checking the token is valid or not by passing the token and getting the user. If user is not null, then it returns user password authentication token object. If user is null, then it returns null, and the client API will get forbidden error, and they cannot access the protected resource. If valid user present, then the API client can proceed with the protected resource or protected endpoint. This method returns user password authentication token object, and that is set it in the security context holder. Next, what we have to do is we have to add this authorization filter to the web security. And here you can see the web security class. In configure method, we have to create authorization filter object, and we have to add. Now I am going to start this application in debug mode. And on application startup, configure method of web security class has been called, and here authentication filter and authorization filters are registered. And application has been started successfully. Now I am going to send a request to this login URL to get JWT token, and in body I am passing username and password. Username is email ID, and password is this one. Click on send, and we got 200 OK, successful response. Click on headers, and here we got authorization header and the public user ID. Duplicate this, select get, and here we got public user ID. Copy this, slash user ID. Now what I am trying to do is I am trying to get information about this particular user ID. Click on send, and request reach the authorization filter, and here I am trying to get header, and header is not there, so it will go inside the if block, and here we got status as 403 forbidden, and access is denied because we have not passed the JWT token. So we have to pass JWT token so that the request will be successful. Copy this, go to headers, authorization header we have to add, paste the token, click on send, and request reached here, and header string is authorization. So based on the header, I'm getting the header value, and we got the value bearer, then JWT token, and here we got the JWT token. Then I'm checking the JWT token is valid, and if it is valid, get the username, and username is peter@gmail.com. So it is valid token. Since it is valid token, it allowed to access the user get URL. So it came to the controller. And this time we got the output. For this particular user ID, this is the details of the user. First name is Peter, last name is D, email is peter@gmail.com. So authorization is successful. Next we will send request with invalid token. We will see what happens. I am changing something. Click on send. Request reached here. And the token is invalid. So here we got exception, and here we got the response status as 403 forbidden. So it is not allowed because JWT token is invalid. Till now we have seen how token based authentication and authorization worked. I will summarize and explain here. Here you can see the API client. Here you can see authentication filter. Here you can see authorization filter. Here you can see user controller. API client send request to this login endpoint with username and password, and it reached authentication filter, and authentication filter checks whether this username and password is matched against the database, and if it is matching and if it is valid, then authentication filter generates JWT token and sends back to the API client. And for any further request, API client has to send JWT token to the server, and API client send request to the server for getting the user information by passing the user ID to this particular endpoint. And also API client has to send this authorization header with JWT token, and it reaches authorization filter, and authorization filter will check whether JWT token is valid, and if JWT token is valid, then it forward the request to the user controller, and user controller get the user information from the database and sends response back to the API client. Suppose JWT token is not valid, and JWT token is not present in the incoming request which API client sends, then authorization filter returns 403 forbidden response to the API client. Here you can see the server, and here you can see API client 1, API client 2, and API client 3. And in case of stateful communication, for each API client, one session will be created. For API client 1, one session will be created, and API client 2, one session will be created, and API client 3, one session will be created. And these sessions can hash some of the information about the request. So even authorization header also will be hashed. Suppose say API client 1 send request to the server, and it sets authorization header with valid JWT token, and request passed and it went through, and the particular authorization header is hashed in the session. And for the next request, suppose API client not set the authorization header, even the request will pass because authorization header is hashed in the session, and this should not happen, and we want to avoid. And for every request, we want to reauthorize the request. So to avoid authorization header to be hashed, web security need to tell to Spring not to create the HTTP session, and this will make REST API stateless, and we will see how to do that. In web security class configurer method, we have to set the session creation policy, and session creation policy should be stateless. And there are different options are there, like always, if required, never, and stateless. And we have to use stateless. You can get Java source code link for each video in the description section of the video. Here you can see the description section. Click on show more, and here you can see the Java source code links. Click on these links to get the Java source code.